I share my screen and go through today's agenda. And if you'd think I'd be used to doing this by now, but yeah, we're not. Here we go. Right, so welcome to the third session already this year. March's Contact Center Network event. Would you believe it's the third session of the year? And would you believe next month is the Contact Center Network's 1 year birthday? So exactly 1 year ago, on the 29th, I think it was, of April, we ran the first session of one of these, and I didn't think for a second it would be running 12 months later, still in some sort of lockdown, guys. So thank you for everybody that's continued to attend these events, and thank you to all the panelists that have been. And we're going to have a special event next month where we're welcoming everybody back, but I'll talk to you a little bit about that a little bit later. But yes, welcome to this month's event, and we're centering, as ever with these things, on the customer experience wheel. So within the Fab Solutions proposition, we look at people, process, technology, and leadership. And what we've tried to do within all of these sessions is try and talk to some of the things that are on this wheel. And this one is very much geared towards technology. So we're going to kind of look at how we can use different types of technology that kind of help bring some of that customer experience to life, and talk about some of the whys and wherefores of automation, AI, and gamification. But before we do that, I want to ask you all this question. So familiarize yourself with the chat button. And again, if you don't know where it is, where have you been? But the chat button should be at the bottom of your screen to the left, I think. You've got a slightly different view while I'm sharing. But I want your thoughts on what are your biggest AI bugbears. So what are the things that really get you goat when it comes to AI, when it comes to automation? I know the first one that I think of when I talk about automation is LinkedIn automation. That one really gets my goat. But yeah, what are the things that in your experience as contact center professionals, CX professionals, people in this industry, find some of the challenges or some of the real irritating bits about AI, automation, and or gamification? And what we'll do is we'll pull some of that stuff out of the chat as we go through, and maybe fire it to some of the panelists. And if anybody's got any particular thoughts or any experiences that you want to share, please do drop them into the chat, and then we'll try and surface those up. We've got until 2 o'clock. So again, we're going to try and squeeze this into an hour. It's always a challenge to squeeze it into an hour, but 60 minutes feels like the sweet spot for covering some of these things. So share with me your biggest AI bugbears into the chat, and we'll come back to those a little bit later. In the meantime, here is the agenda for today. So you're currently busy networking in the chat, which is great. We've got 3 awesome guest panelists, which I'll introduce in a second. At the end of today's session, I just want to kind of ask you for your feedback on how today's session's gone and what else you want to see in some of these sessions. If it's your first session to the Contact Center Network, welcome. Thank you very much for attending. And then I've got a few save the dates, which we'll cover at the end for the next couple of events that's coming on. But first, let me introduce you to Savage Garden meets Go West. And Jimmy will understand that joke with the pictures that are on here now. But we've got 3 great panelists that I'm going to let introduce themselves in a second. But we've got David Naylor, who comes from Humanotics, which is all about AI and automation. And David's going to share some real great experience from some of the stuff that he's done at Humanotics with some of the questions that we're going to be asking. And then we've got a couple of tribesmen from TMAC. So we've got George, who's the CIO of TMAC. So he's the brains behind it. And then we've got Jimmy, who's the front man, who's the CEO of TMAC, which is the Modular Analytics Company. But I'm not good. They'll do a much better job than I will at introducing themselves. So I'm going to come to the top of the table and just let David take yourself off mute, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about Humanotics, and then we'll go to George and Jimmy for intros. So David, over to you, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Gary. Good afternoon, everybody. Glad you could join us this afternoon. Nice to see a few familiar faces out there. I'm David Naylor. I run a company called Humanotics. We help clients to understand what AI is and implement that in their customer operations in the most efficient and effective way, which basically means working with people to build AI into the way that people work, as opposed to fitting AI, sort of fitting people around the AI. So 25 years in customer management, working in all aspects of the operational sort of side of things, from building contact centers from the ground up to doing a ton of work in the last few years with things like speech analytics, which is where a lot of the AI advancements have taken place. So helping clients to understand sort of how that sort of technology works, what it can do, what it can't do. I think that's the key thing, is sort of being real. As one of my clients says, you make us you bring us back to reality when we start talking about what we like to do. PhD in AI 30 years ago, somehow left it all behind, and then suddenly, hey, it's caught up with me, and it's really nice to be a great opportunity to bring both the AI and the customer experience work together in Humanotics.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. I'm sure people have got some interesting questions that they can ask you. I'm sure you're ably equipped with some good experience and some examples to tell us how we can make it even better. George, let's get an introduction to yourself.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Hi, everyone. So this is actually my first session. So hello.
My name's very welcome.
So yeah, as Gary said, I'm the Chief Information Officer for TMAC. My background is very heavily in data science, data analytics. I come from a bit more of a marketing background, but it means that my focus is very heavily on sort of customer experience. So I come at AI from that angle a lot more. The sort of stuff that I've been working on revolves predominantly around things like speech transcription and all of the AI bits and pieces around contact centers. So, next best action and all that sort of good stuff.
Yeah, and some interesting stuff coming down the line with that, which I'm sure we'll hear about in just a second. Last but not least, Jimmy, hello and welcome.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Jimmy Hosang. I'm the CEO of the Modular Analytics Company, or TMAC, and we're an AI and machine learning company. We'll explain the difference between those two things probably as we go on. But what we really focus on is helping people make better decisions faster. I think the etymology of the company kind of stems from 12 years of myself working in data science and analytics, and I worked across a lot of big transformation projects for a lot of big companies, and all of them apart from one failed. And I thought it was me. I thought I was like a bad penny. And maybe I am, but I started to reflect on all of the things that went wrong in data transformation, digital transformation, and analytics. And I started to uncover that it was really it was a feature, not a bug. And we tried to create a company that is tackling those bugs. We want to be outcome based. We want to drive value through AI, not to have like a chin stroking exercise, but to get real value from the things that we do, and to drive return on investment for our clients. And just another couple of things. So I think it was around 4 years ago, around this time, that me and George first met each other, because we were working together. And the first time we met was at a pub down in Nottingham, but then the second time we met was we were flown over to France to do a project together, and we got incredibly drunk on the first day, and we really had to keep it together, like hacking through lots of code with some angry Frenchmen at our backs the day after, and that was around 4 years ago. And then 3 years ago, as TMAC was forming, we went to a conference, and I saw David talking around humanotics and the use of AI. So I'm having a little bit of a fanboy moment that I'm appearing on a panel with him. So yeah, really interesting to argue with George like we do when we're drunk, and to gain some experience from David.
Brilliant fanboy moment when it comes to AI. I love it. I love it, Jimmy. So I have prepared a series of questions for the panel, but you don't want to hear me kind of asking all the questions. What we want to hear is the stuff that you guys want answers to, or what you've got views on, or what you've got thoughts on in particular, that we can pitch to the panel. So I'm going to start off with 1 or 2 questions, but what I want you to do is, if you have a question around anything around today's topics, which is AI, automation, or gamification, drop it into the chat today. Sarah will pick up on some of the questions that we've got, and then we'll fire it through to some of the panelists. But first of all, I just wanted from some of the experts. So we're going to start with you, Jimmy. And you talked about it earlier. Say, what actually is AI and the difference between AI and automation for all those people that aren't necessarily as illuminated as maybe David? But let's come to you first, Jimmy, and then we'll expand across the panel.
So I see it a little bit. I see it's a little bit in different stages. So from my experience, kind of historically, you had kind of analytics or predictive modeling, and what you had in that day, you had kind of static data sets that you had to manually build, and then once you'd manually built those data sets, you applied some statistical modeling capabilities on them, and then over the course of months and maybe even years, you deployed them into a real environment. So typically, when I've done marketing models, you know, a process to build that data, to build a model which says the likelihood that you bought a loan, then getting it through governance to clear, and then eventually like using it for marketing might take kind of 6 months, and you go on that kind of process. And I think that is kind of that was the old school approach. So machine learning, it takes that process and it turns it into a factory process. So effectively, you don't just build a data set, you have a data set that is constantly updating, and it's getting feedback from many different sources, many different contact points. In many cases, it's getting feedback from the decisions that's being made into how to optimize it. So you've got all of this data, you know, big data, you call it, but, you know, clickstream data from digital places. You've got your contact center, you've got your customer who's always doing purchasing behaviors and things. You've got a dynamic data set, and then you've got not just, and you've got models being applied. And in many cases as well, you don't just have one model, you have multiple models being applied. And they're all running under a kind of a champion challenger. So you're always trying to find like what's the best model at the best time. But with machine learning, you still have a smart person who's building the process and applying the constraints to the process and telling it what to do, like David and George. With AI, it's more of a lights out process, where eventually over time, the machine is learning to do things in a better way and constantly improving and updating itself. That's how I would determine it. And therefore, when we talk around AI, I think we all, especially probably the people on this panel, sometimes talk about it because it makes it easy for people, and some of it is a bit sexy. But real AI is creative, and I think they call it, George will correct me, but it's like general intelligence. It's like it can think like a human, and I don't think that we're really there when it comes to proper AI. We're there in some cases, but not in others. But yeah, roughly speaking, like that's the journey of the different things. But here we go.
I think that's really interesting. I'm going to get David and George's view on that, and then I'm going to ask Paul Malloy, because I think one thing you've just touched on there, Jimmy, is really interesting around kind of trusting the data, and then Paul's asked a really good question. So David and George, give us your kind of, if you like, dictionary definition of what AI and automation is, and then we'll come to Paul's question. So David, let's go to you first.
So I think, first of all, they're very different things. Yeah, automation, you know, is the automation of tasks. You know, so if you can automate something, it means that you understand it very clearly. It's very straightforward. It's very well defined. It doesn't really take a lot of grey matter to actually work out what to do. And that's so. What we're seeing from a customer service perspective is, you know, where those tasks are well defined and can be easily documented with very little sort of complex decision making, we can build automation. So when we talk about RPA, which is, you know, so the robotic process automation, robotics in that sense is just logic of making a decision and taking a next step and pushing data from here to there and doing all those things which humans do monotonously in certain types of jobs, dealing with things which require no brain power. So those are great things that we can automate. When you think about AI, we're talking about decision making. So where it takes where there's a grey area and it requires some grey matter to take some data, make a decision based on different sources of data. That's where the machine learning models and previously, I guess, the simpler statistical models that we've had for many, many years, as Jimmy says, that's where we could start to make decisions and create and replace some of the thinking which humans would have to do. At the moment, as Jimmy says, it's still very basic. We do not have thinking machines. They all learn based on parameters that we give them. They do not reason. A machine does not decide to do something. It's told to do something because we train it to do that. So
I think if you watch Terminator, you'll disagree. Eventually, there will be a consciousness.
Yeah. There's some great videos I can point you towards where you can sort of think, gosh, surely that machine is thinking. It's not, but so we are building machine learning models with lots of data, with much more data than we ever had, which looks like these things are doing things themselves. We've seen examples where chatbots have been let go into the environment and have become, and I've learned things from people and become offensive and all sorts of different things, which not worth going into in more detail, but suddenly get shut down because they've been trained by humans, not because that's what they want to do. So to me, there's two different things there. The AI sort of is the decision making, which glues the automation together. So you can do some automation, and the decisions needed. Can some AI do that? Yes, it can. Okay, make a decision, take the next action, do some more automation. If it can't, you hand it off to a human. So I'm trying to put in some practical terms about how it looks in a real world environment.
And I think that's really interesting, because I think my perception before kind of getting more involved in AI was that actually it was thinking for itself. It was doing its own thing and it was making its own decisions. And that's really interesting that it still requires that human interaction in order to perfect it. George, would you have any builds on anything that David and Jimmy said there?
So I completely agree. I think one of the big problems that we've got as an industry at the moment is that there is no generally agreed definition of what AI is and what it isn't. So what that results in is everyone sells everything as AI, even though most of the time it is really automation. It's the ability to take data into a format that makes decisions very, very straightforward. I mean, the way that I like to look at AI and sort of the next level of AI is where you look at the data and you can't just immediately see what the obvious decision is going to be. It can read that nuance. And that's sort of what I'm really interested in. So yeah, it's a shorter answer, but everyone else has already said everything that I was going to say.
I think it's interesting. But don't worry, we'll come back to that later, and we'll start with you. I'm going to come to Paul and ask Paul to fire his question to which panelists he'd like to hear the response from. But over to you, Paul Malloy.
Thanks, Gary. Guys, really interesting topic for me. And one of the things when I was at British Gas, I was trying to develop was a predictive capability within contact propensity. So not only who's going to call, but when they're going to call and by which channel. And it was building up an event pipeline based on data relationships. But one of the things I struggled with was trying to get stakeholders to understand, as the data scientists and the data engineers, built this thing, it was effectively going to become a black box solutions where, we would get outputs and outcomes, and we need to start to trust it. And I guess my question was, in your experience, how do you get people who don't necessarily want to get into the detail, they don't want to understand how it works per se, how do you get them to really buy into the fact that this thing could make a difference and could be a business game changer? Just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Brilliant, really good question. Let's start with George because we came to Jimmy first. So George, over to you.
Yes, that's a great question. I used to work for British Gas as well, actually, so that's interesting. I worked for British Gas business for 5-6 years. But no, so I tend to think that it's around the way that you use AI. Again, the way that it's typically sold is that it's a platform that you just spin it up and let it go. But to David's point, AI can then very quickly spin out of control. It's very difficult to have those controls. Where I typically come from it is more of a using it to supplement human performance. So using it to influence an agent's decision in a telephony contact, for example, make their decisions much easier so that they can get through these things quicker. So that's my preferred way of doing deploying AI, I think, is yeah, using it to supplement rather than replace.
I think it's a really interesting point, isn't it, George? And it's one of those to say, actually, how do you create the benefits case or the business case that the leader is going to dip into us? So I think that point is really, really important. David, would you have any other any other builds on that, what George has said?
I think, I mean, George is absolutely right. I guess it's how do you then sort of take that forward as in the business? Well, it's a lot of the, whether it's predictive modeling or for chatbots or anything where you've got some of that sort of intelligence sort of being used, it's putting into the hands of people in the operation who can sort of use it and get some benefit from it and become the advocates of, well, actually it is providing some benefit to me, whether it's in making decisions about sort of what's the sort of next best action with this person in terms of having, if they're called in, you've gathered some data, doing some prediction about sort of what's going to happen, and advising the agent, and building confidence in the business, because you're then you're actually putting the agents in control of the actual decision, just being supported by that AI. Before you ever go anywhere near sort of putting something in that's automated and is just contacting the customer with predictive next actions or offers or whatever, it's proving the value in a more controlled environment. So control, small steps, sort of incrementally proving the value of this stuff. And I think the black box idea is actually, it doesn't need to be a black box. Sort of you can break it down into sort of stages so that you can actually sort of see, work out sort of what it's doing and why not necessarily why it's doing things, but you can sort of break it down to stages of the prediction, so you can actually sort of start to understand some of those decisions and how you get to those decisions. So this whole thing of sort of not being able to understand it is actually not quite true in reality when you start building these things properly into a production environment.
I think there's some really interesting points that you're saying there, David, and I think there is a human element to that as well, which is going to kind of come to a question that Elaine Lee's posed. But before we do that and come to Elaine, Jimmy, from your perspective, is there anything else that you think actually the benefits or the business case supports to kind of help engage senior leaders to kind of invest in that kind of AI approach?
Yeah, so it probably goes back a little bit to the journey of like data and AI. So I did a bit of a talk last week with a load of nerds like me, and we were asked questions about AI, and we all kind of said similar things around creativity and culture and getting buy-in and stuff. It was all, and we talked less about the technical aspects and more around that bit being really, really important. I think first things first, like, don't start with data, like start with the business case and start with a creative mindset of going, what would be the art of the possible if we could, increase retention rates by X by giving us better decisions? What would that do? And start to think of like, what's the size of the opportunity? Then I would start by building really, really quick and dirty like technology and stack where you can start to trial some of this stuff. So I think what happens is a lot of people go tech first. Right, now I need an all singing, all dancing machine learning AI deployment. And that's the wrong way of doing it, because you're putting the cart before the horse. So I'd start with like a small kind of, I don't know what they call it, like a skunkworks or a POC or something and build a really rubbish data set with a really, really dirty model and get it in the hands of your agents or wherever you're deploying it, and start making decisions and start learning. Because then what happens is everybody starts learning, but your model starts collecting data points to learn. Then just iterate through that process. Me and George have done it like many times. The very first model that you ever deploy is really, really poor. and then you've got to improve it, and you've got to improve it. Now, when you've got a machine learning process, the machine learning process improves it for you. But start with a simple dirty model and continuously improve it, and then get it to a state where you can do machine learning. And then finally, just what David said, like I think the perception is that it was a black box, but imagine you don't know all of the decisions that your agents are making in the contact center. Like, some have bad days, like some people's boilers broke, some people like missed the bus and got there, and you've got a load of decisions that are a black box in your company that you just don't call them a black box, you call them people, and you call it, within the machines, it's capturing all of your data, all of the changes it's making, why it used this model rather than another model. It's perfect. You've got almost, in fact, sorry, not perfect data, but you've got loads more data to go, this is why this robot made this decision, whereas you don't have that with your base. So I'm just backing David up on that. And that's another thing to do. I think, like, yeah, you just flip that narrative. I think one big blocker when it's about culture and the use of data, sorry to go on, is compliance teams. So compliance, treating customers fairly, things like that. And something that we often have to face is, well, why are you okay using data to push this offer to this customer? And what I say is, but right now, you let your agents just talk to them about whatever, or your marketing team about whatever. Surely it's better to use the data to determine, like, the underlying need that the customer might have for something, and then to talk about something that's relevant, not something that's on a sales target for yourselves personally.
And I think that's a really interesting point, Jimmy, and I'm going to come to Elaine now, because I think when we talk about how we can use AI to guide us into decisions around product and purchasing product, I think it's also how can we use and leverage AI to understand customer behaviors and customer feelings and customer sentiment. And I think Elaine's question is a really interesting one that Rhiannon's also kind of curious about as well. So Elaine, I'm going to let you ask your question so that you get it right and I don't paraphrase it in the wrong way. So over to you.
Thanks, Gary. Customers in vulnerable circumstances, it's a thing on everybody's lips at the moment. All the regulators are talking about it. And the FCA's guidance is pushing organisations to be able to identify and detect vulnerabilities for themselves. And they did have something in their original guidance which was about asking customers to declare it themselves. Actually, I think they've come to their senses and realised that's not the way to go. But how do you think that AI could, or A, do you think AI can help organisations to better detect it, and B, and ideally in the moment, so that the person who is handling the call has some supporting information coming through, or reasonable adjustments options being offered to them? Is that possible in real time? And if not, how quickly can it be implemented, and where do you see the benefits coming? And then I've got a supplementary question, if I get a chance to, about the data protection element of that, and making sure that we've got the correct consents in place to be able to profile the data.
So let's tackle the first bit first, and we'll come to David, and then we'll tackle the DP section with George, if that's all right. So David, what's your thoughts on that one from Elaine?
So it's a really interesting challenge, Elaine, which and doing a lot of work with customers with speech analytics is one of the things they say, sort of, we want to identify vulnerable customers. The problem is that apart from, as you just said, sort of getting customers to declare it, a lot of customers really don't know that they are vulnerable in that sense, and they don't explicitly say, "Well, I'm a vulnerable customer, and therefore I need sort of XYZ support." Now, so because it comes down to a very subtle understanding of the conversation, and that's in sort of where we train our agents, and that really becomes sort of it's quite unique for almost all cases to say, based on what I've heard in this call, I'm putting these factors together and making the assumption this customer is clearly vulnerable. Unless if you've got that data and the database in some way that it's flagged as vulnerable because of medical needs that are known about, then actually spotting that with machines today is actually really, really hard. So it's not something you can just switch on. Sort of no vendor could ever offer that sort of capability to identify those customers. Certainly, it's possible if over time you can develop sort of tools in listening to the conversation that listen for certain things, you could flag possible vulnerabilities, but you know, they're so diverse and different that that's going to take quite a bit of time for technology to build up effectively what sort of searches of what's been said in the call to determine that. If you could do it, if you could find those things, you could certainly flag them there and then. In the technologies, you know, certainly possible to be able to listen to the conversation real time and identify things, but it's knowing what to identify that is the problem in this particular case.
And I'm going to come to Jimmy before we move on to the data protection piece with George. In terms of that predictive piece, Jimmy, a lot of the stuff that TMAC do is able to predict certain patterns. So do you see any kind of ability there with some of the kind of the speech analytics side of things to be able to predict that vulnerability?
Yeah, so I think George was going to probably say this, say something similar. So I won't steal George's thunder and I'll let him say it. But I think David's right. But where we've been doing quite a lot of research is with behavioural scientists around what people say when they're vulnerable and the indicators of vulnerability, because it's not kind of binary phrases, it's contextual. You're trying to find the contextual things within the conversation, which obviously is much more difficult. If somebody says I'm deaf, like you can pick that up, but when somebody says you know, I'll tell you just a little bit, but some people who are suicidal say certain things that can sound like perfectly reasonable, like things like, I know exactly what I need to do, but what they need to do isn't like paying off the credit card and stuff. It might be something more drastic, and it's ways in which you can pick those up. But I'll let George kind of finish up from that.
Bro, George, we'll come to you, and then we've got a question from the audience from Ed. So Ed, prime yourself. George, over to you.
Cool. Yeah, so we actually did some work recently with a financial institution where, as Jimmy says, they had behavioral scientists in to try and train some agents to be effectively customer vulnerability champions. One of the things that we found is that it's almost impossible to build a general vulnerability model. People talk about it in far too many different ways. What you sort of have to start looking at is building a vulnerability taxonomy, almost, where you start at a top level, you have hard and soft indicators, and then multiple different ways of detecting it beneath that. That seems to work quite well. To David's point, it doesn't work. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. Different customers speak about vulnerability in different ways in different industries. But that's a way that has worked pretty well in that instance. And yeah, again, it comes down to the human element, right? The really difficult thing with all of this is getting the training data, is getting the ones and zeros that say this person is and is not vulnerable in this specific way. The way that they approached it was by training people to identify it. They had fairly intensive training to identify it and did a lot of call listening. And by getting that training data, they could then map that out.
And just to that point as well, just really quickly, like when we talk around the outputs and the decisions that come off it, like it's a probability that we get. So when we talk around the decisions and like, yeah, we do this or we do that, what we're effectively doing is the output is a probability. Now, if the probability to, you know, buy breakdown cover, like we've got a probability for a customer, and we might go, oh, we only want to go to people, we only want to say market to with a consent, you know, those who are 90% likely. But then if you inverse it, what's the likelihood that a customer's vulnerable? We might do something with everybody who's over 50% likely to be vulnerable. We might set a much lower bar because we might want to capture more people. And some of it is around, you know, in some of the stuff we do, you know, I think we'll all admit that it's we have to seek a return on investment. But other things we do is around, like, you know, de-risking things for our customers and for businesses, and actually like providing like better experience for customers. And so yeah, it all depends on where we'd set those parameters against the likelihood.
And I think, George, you touched on something there about the human interaction and how you can train machines to become more effective. And I think that ties in nicely to the question that Ed's got. So Ed, if you want to take yourself off mute and fire your question at George, I think we could get some get a response for you. Over to you, Ed.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I mean, I come from a speech science background, but I've seen across quite a lot of different, and I'm doing air quotes here, AI. There is an underlying requirement for a model to have had a good deal of human input at the beginning to effectively tag its data with what a human thinks that data is. And it can even be things like, I don't know, for the Google car, you've got a whole bunch of people in offices looking at images, outlining what things are on the street and saying that's a car. And then that's all feeding into a model. Do we, how significant is that? Does the panel have any opinions on the, I don't know, the quality of the initial modeling, maybe?
I think it's a good question. So it questions the reliability, I suppose, of AI when it's fed by a human. So George, what's your view on that?
Yeah, it's incredibly important. The quality of data that you put into any model, be it AI, machine learning, or a traditional model, is always going to be hugely, it's going to affect the outcome hugely. We're not really at the point of having, general understanding models at the moment, where you just, have a model, feed it some text, and it'll tell you what it's about. We're getting closer, I think. You look at some of the stuff that like OpenAI have done with their GPT-3 model. It requires much less training data, but it still requires training data. So I don't think it's a problem that has been solved adequately yet. And typically I think that the more training data that you get, the better outcome you get, so long as it's captured in a consistent way.
Can I just say something there as well, just so for everybody, because like Ed comes on to a really good point, is that like when we talk about AI and when people talk about different types of model and stuff, like and the training data, it's people far and wide in offices, sometimes tens of thousands of people listening to a call and tagging it. Oh, that's a change of address. That's a change of address. That's a change of address. And then when somebody sells you an intent model. Oh, this intent model, it's got X amount of classifiers. It can understand change of address. That's not just coming out like that's because people have tagged it in the background. And I think that's where myself, David, and George, we talk about like demystifying that AI piece, because so much of what you think of as AI right now, it's humans bashing buttons, and then the automation of those that button bashing.
And I think that's interesting, that, Jimmy, because when you start to think about how much time and investment is done from a human in training the AI, I think it's a really significant investment for anybody thinking about that business case. I want to come to Tracy for her question next, which talks more around kind of potential outdated assumptions, and then I'm going to come to Adam with his question, which kind of feeds a little bit about that in terms of AI and habits. So Tracy, if you fire your question, I'm guessing who it's going to be for, but if you fire your question, and then we'll come to Adam after yourself.
Yes, well, naturally I'll pick on David because I know him. Hello, David. I'd start with the well-known quote that's attributed to Henry Ford, which is, if I'd have asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. There are a number of assumptions that I believe, because one of the main things I do is study behaviours. There are a lot of assumptions made about what customers actually want. So when so there's a really outdated view that customers are happy in every case to sit and queue and wait for their answer, whereas actually in reality a lot of us don't want an answer until we'd be happy to wait for 2 days, even if it's like I've got a bit of a query on my bill this month or my utility, whatever. So I was just wondering what experience you have about how outdated some of the views are about what customers really want, because what they're doing is they're basing customer behavior on the options that they currently have. So I strongly believe that although customer needs have not changed and will not change probably for quite a while, their expectations have, and there's a subtle difference between the two.
Interesting.
Really interesting. And I think one of the things which has changed dramatically sort of in the last few years is the fact that we all carry one of these around, so this is how I want to communicate with you through a mobile channel, and there's multiple different ways that I can talk to you through this, I can it's sort of the video and the audio and the text are all merged into one. But what I don't want you to do is to start sending me stuff through channels that I don't use anymore, or have to be forced to contact you through channels I don't use anymore. So I guess a couple of years ago I started working with a company that's basically sort of moving the sign-up process for all sorts of institutions, financial service institutions, loan companies, onto this device, basically, sort of getting rid of all the paper, and it basically becomes totally asynchronous. And so I can be partway through my loan application, and it's all here, and I can do it when I want. I can save stuff when I want. I can come back to it when I want, and I'm in control of the whole process. And just when you're sort of saying, I don't want to be forced to ring and to go into a queue and wait for the answer. And I spent 2 hours on the phone to a mobile company a couple of weeks ago, and it was just a horrendous process. What I want to do is to be able to fire off my request. It's me. It's asynchronous. It sort of goes to you. You process it and come back to me through this device. And I don't have to think about it, but I know that it's being dealt with. Now, whether that being dealt with is some automation, or whether it's an agent, that's what I want to do. So I think moving to this view that it's all mobile first is the way we need to think about sort of the customer views. Now, so I do agree. There's a lot of people who are still sticking with separate channels, and that's just legacy in terms of the technology. And I think it's just they're slow to catch up, and it's to link these things up and make it a seamless experience, so I can choose and be in control of when and how I want to communicate is where we need to move to.
That's why I've got a beef with customer surveys, because often it's based on what we already give you, what do you want, rather than what do you want. So that's what I'm concerned about, is that there are outdated beliefs on what customers want.
And I think it'd be interesting to get Jimmy's view on that, because I think, Jimmy, your model is very much feels almost like it's putting the customer back in control rather than the organization. So I'd be interested on your views on that.
I'm probably going to be pretty controversial. We're not doing, I see a lot of people not doing anything what the customer wants, but they're just trying to reduce cost.
Yes.
And they think they reduce cost by bashing everything to digital. And it's a misunderstanding of what their customers are and what they want. And it's, it's not automation to make it easy for the customer. It's automation to reduce cost. And it's cost, cut it to the bone. And what they're doing is they're commoditizing themselves. It's not even good for themselves, because if you can do everything online, then people will see that you're actually rubbish at doing it online, and they'll go to somebody else who does it better. And in so many cases, what has made a brand great is its people, and they're just trying to automate it all out of them. And so I'm just completely with you. And so to David's point, the asynchronous experience and going to where you want and getting the answers, getting the answers at a time you want. We do voice messaging now. Why do I need to? I'm gonna go a bit out there, but why do I need to call up and queue on my time when I can send a voice message and get an outbound call There's no need to do that, and that's to do with legacy. But broadly speaking, I don't see most companies doing things for the customer. They do it we're doing it for the customer because customers want digital, whereas they're doing it to cut costs so they can automate. And you can see that in the amount of rubbish chatbots that you get that's just send you into a spin, and it's doing it to deflect the contact rather than to get you the answer that you want.
And I think that's a really interesting point. And before we move on to the question from Adam, I'm going to come to David and ask your view on chatbots, because I see on social media so often complaints about chatbot experiences, clunky chatbot, the need to not speak to or the need to try and overcome the chatbot experience to get to a human. So what's your, I suppose, your top tips on trying to create the optimum chatbot experience?
There's just one thing I should say about it, really. I mean, there's lots that because a whole workshop, a whole sort of days and days of activity on this that you could go into. Design it from the conversation with the human. You know, so forget the technology. You know, there's more platforms out there you could ever imagine that could build a chatbot for you. But you design the conversation as if it's two people talking, and build scenarios around that. So when we design these conversations, we have two people sat on chairs back to back, and one's an agent and one's the bot, and you have a conversation, and you map it all out as a conversation, all the ums and ers and all the bits and pieces which take you down different routes. Once you understand that, then you can go and look at, well, let's get some technology to build this out, and that's when you start to get to the, well, what does technology do? Does it meet the needs of what we're trying to build? So, and
I think you've just hit the nail on the head for the question that Paul's asked in there, in terms of how do you build empathy into AI? And I think, again, it starts with that human interaction first, and saying, what's the human interaction that demonstrates empathy? And then how do you try and replicate that? Go on, David.
As a rule of thumb, if you can describe it as a human, then you can try to put some automation around it from an AI perspective. You can try, so like tone analysis. If you can describe what a positive tone sounds like, or a confident tone, and you can say, here's some examples of what is confident and what is not, then you can sort of build a machine to try and replicate that. It's not always perfect, but just use that as an idea of thinking, well, if I can describe it, then we can probably go some way to automate it. Empathy is quite a hard one, because there's quite a few factors in that. Depends on what you're saying, not just how you're saying it.
But I know we're running out of time, but David, is it also the case though? It's like empathy and understanding about what your customer actually wants. Because the thing that really drives me insane is voice-led IVRs, when I'm on a train and I have to shout out my personal PIN to get through a voice-led IVR, or some sort of personal information, just like, I don't want to do this. I'm in a public space, and and it's almost like some of this stuff I think is around cost cutting, but then some of it is it like really great ideas, like just not properly thought through?
Yeah, I think in terms of putting empathy on AI is really interesting, and I've got a slightly controversial opinion on it, I think. So when you're trying to make an AI appear empathetic, it's not actually being empathetic. You're just trying to paint it to be empathetic. And you're kind of trying to trick the customer, which I don't think is a great experience generally. My view on chatbots is that you need to try and get your customer from the point of calling to where they need to go as quickly as possible. And you need to make sure that it's the right place that they need to get to. To Jimmy's point earlier, like chatbots are so frequently built with operational metrics in mind. We're going to build this chatbot and it's going to reduce our AHT. Reduce AHT correlates with increased customer satisfaction, so it's the right thing to do. But it's not how it works typically. You end up building loops to prevent people from getting to where they need to go, which reduces customer satisfaction, and you're just trading operational effectiveness for the satisfaction of your customers. So yeah, I don't think that necessarily answers the question of how to make AI empathetic. But
you know what? I think you're spot on, George. And I think the common complaint that I hear from people around bots is that they're trying to be something that they're not. So actually just accept that they're not, that an AI system isn't necessarily something that's going to be empathetic because it's not a human. And I think when we try and get bots to do things that humans are when they're not, is a really challenging one. And people might wildly disagree with that, but I think just be upfront. If it's a bot, it's a bot. But that's my personal view. I'm going to come to Adam for his question because he's been waiting patiently, and I think it kind of feeds some of that stuff in terms of behaviors and habits of AI. And then I think we might have chance for one more question. So if anybody's got another burning question, we might be able to squeeze it in. So Adam, over to you.
Cool, thanks, Gary. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep, awesome. So yes, this was around, I guess it was some of Jimmy's comments earlier on, talking through how the difference between AI and ML, and actually going from the statistical predictive modeling all the way through to what AI actually is. And when we talk about the data that we're using and feeding through a machine learning algorithm, you're going to want usually a large volume of good, clean, reliable data. But a large amount of that data will be driven by human actions or decision making. So it's naturally going to pick up its bad habits. Now, I've obviously not experienced in this. So normally would you expect yourselves to put, in terms of the constraints that you would put into that algorithm or the decision making process, would it be the constraints that will try and pick out and weed out the bad habits to ensure that the correct decision is always made? Or would you actually look to keep that, that actual incorrect decision making in there because it's part of someone's particular behavior set?
Interesting point to say, how human do you make an AI system? David, let's come to you for your views on that first.
I think, I mean, I wouldn't advocate sort of keeping some of those things in there, but I think naturally as you build these solutions, you're going to have a lot of errors in them as it progresses, as you build it out. And I think back to sort of Jimmy's comment earlier, you know, sort of having some sort of skunk works or sort of something where you're testing these things out with in a sort of semi-live environment is actually really the key thing to be doing here, and weeding those things out and understanding sort of why it's making errors, what can you do to improve the performance to eliminate those. But you get to a point where there's definitely an 80-20 here, where you say, look, it's just there's too much complexity in here to be able to get a model to build to get this answer right, which is back to that point of how far can you take AI in terms of making decisions. There comes a point where actually it's far better to leave that decision and that particular aspect with a customer service agent or just a human decision making process, because you'll never get there with the machine at the current state, the current capability, without the massive power of sort of machines that people don't have access to. And it just return on investment of trying to do all of that stuff and make everything work in a machine, it's just not there.
I'd agree with that. And I think Paul's summary there at the end, Paul Malloy says, human augmentation is still key in delivering customer resolution, which I think is a really, really valid point. So you can't completely remove the human from the process, no matter how much you try. The machines will not have their uprising, and Judgment Day will not come. But that's been a really, really interesting discussion. I think I'd love to spend more time talking about this, and I think we could spend 2-3 hours talking about this stuff. But I wanted to give people an opportunity to just kind of maybe bring some burning platforms. If you do want further conversations with David, with Jimmy, with George, please feel free to reach out. I think they've all put their LinkedIn profiles into the chat, so please do make connections. This is about kind of making new connections and trying to build a bit of a community. So really useful stuff. Thank you very much to everybody who has contributed with questions. Really, really thoughtful questions there, and I think really did test the panel, which was great. I've popped a couple of links into the chat. The first one is just a survey on today's webinar even, just to get your thoughts on it. If you'd like to just take a moment just to complete that, it should take about 60 seconds. And then the second link is the link to the next event that's coming up, which is in April, which will be a celebration of 12 months of the Contact Center Network. And we're going to have a slightly different approach where we're going to be inviting some of the previous guests back and doing some breakout rooms in smaller bite-sized groups. So we've got opportunity to kind of ask some additional questions and get an update on where we are from maybe 12 months ago. But I've really enjoyed today's session. Please do keep those dates in your diary. The next one is the 29th of April, 1 till 2. And then the May event will be all about quality assurance and delivering great customer outcomes. And that is on, I think, the 25th of May, 1 till 2. So love to see you all at the next one. Thank you, everybody who's participated today. Thank you very much for your questions. And we've got 3 minutes left. So is there anybody who's got maybe a 30-second question that we can test, or we can call it quits for today? And I'll see you all at the next one. Feel free to take yourself off mute. And if you want to go, you can go. But we've got 3 minutes left. So just last thing from me, say thanks, George. Thanks, David. Thanks, Jimmy. And thanks, everybody else, for tuning in and joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
See you all, folks. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thanks.